The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-3 was built for the wrong part of the Eastern Front sky. It was designed as a high-altitude interceptor and could do its best work above roughly 5,000 meters, but most Soviet-German fighter combat in 1941 happened much lower. That turned its main strength into a mismatch. The MiG-3 could still be fast, but near the deck, it was no longer the aircraft the war needed. Then the engine line closed the door. Production was terminated in late 1941 because the AN-35A was tied too closely to the AN-38 needed for the Ilyushin Il-2. The fighter did not lose because it was pointless. It lost because its war happened at the wrong altitude and with the wrong engine priorities. The Lavochkin-Gorbunov-Gudkov LaGG-3 proved that a modern fighter could still feel like a stopgap. It first flew on March 28, 1940, entered service in 1941, and was built in huge numbers, more than 6,500 in all. That scale did not make pilots love it. The aircraft was underpowered, overweight, and difficult enough in handling that its bad reputation spread fast. Soviet pilots gave it cruel nicknames for a reason. The real verdict came later. The design line only became truly dangerous after the airframe took a radial engine and turned into the La-5. The route survived. The LaGG-3 itself stayed trapped as the hard, heavy aircraft that had to exist before the real answer showed up. The Yakovlev Yak-2, originally the BB-22, was fast enough to impress Stalin before it was mature enough to trust. Ordered into production in 1939 before proper evaluation was finished, it looked like a sleek Soviet answer to the fast light bomber idea. The prototype's speed was real. The service aircraft was another story. Tests showed inadequate engine cooling, weak brakes, unreliable fuel systems, poor stability, and a drop in speed once the machine was turned into a real bomber. The report from service evaluation was blunt enough to call it unreliable and not combat capable in that form. Only 111 were built, and most were lost in the opening phase of the war. The Yak-2 did not fail because the concept sounded foolish. It failed because the airplane reached units before it was ready to be a bomber. The Arkhangelsky Ar-2 came out just late enough to make its own replacement obvious. It was a refined dive bomber development of the old SB line, first flew in October 1940, and state testing judged it good enough for production. Around 190 were built, and before the German invasion, about 120 had already reached units. That sounds like a program with momentum. It was not enough. The aircraft still carried cooling and defensive armament weaknesses, and the Petlyakov Pe-2 was already taking over the same part of the war with more political weight and more future behind it. At least half the R-2 fleet was destroyed in 1941, and the rest never built a larger story. The R-2 did not die on the drawing board. It died after entering service and finding that the war had already chosen a different bomber line. The Sukhoi Su-2 was not a bad airplane. It was a bad winner in the wrong contest. It was the first aircraft designed by Pavel Sukhoi, entered service before the German invasion, and in the first 6 months of the war, Soviet records credited Su 2 units with about 5,000 sorties, while 222 aircraft were lost in combat and related wartime causes. That loss rate was serious, but it was not proof of a useless machine. The deeper problem was role and priority. The Red Air Force needed clearer answers, the Petlyakov Pe-2 for fast bombing, and the Ilyushin Il-2 for armored attack. By March 1942, Su-2 production was ending. The aircraft could do several jobs. The Soviet war machine had already decided it wanted more specialized ones. The Yermolayev Yer-2 looked like a long-range bomber answer and kept tripping over engines, takeoff performance, and production breaks. It first flew in May 1940 and reached combat in time to take part in the August 1941 raids on Berlin that gave it instant prestige. The project never stabilized. Production of the early version stopped in August 1941, so factories could turn toward the Il-2, and later diesel-powered development kept promising range while delivering weight and reliability problems. The diesel versions could push range far beyond the gasoline aircraft, but the engines themselves remained the weak link. The Yer-2 had enough promise to survive in several forms. It never had enough maturity to become the long-range Soviet bomber solution its numbers on paper suggested. The Petlyakov Pe-8 proved that the Soviet Union could build a real 4-engine heavy bomber. and still not build a strategic bombing force around it. It was the only Soviet four-engine bomber produced during the war, and it did fly the kinds of missions that give a heavy bomber prestige, including Berlin raids in 1941 and the long-range 1942 flight that carried Vyacheslav Molotov to Britain and the United States. The number that matters most is 93. That was the total production. 93 aircraft cannot create the kind of heavy bomber arm the United States or Britain fielded. The P-8 was real, capable, and symbolically important. It still failed at scale. Soviet heavy bombing remained more a statement than a system. The Petlyakov Pe-3bis was an emergency answer, and it always looked like one. After the first German night attacks on Moscow in 1941, Soviet authorities needed a long-range night fighter fast and chose the P-2 because it was already in production. The conversion was so urgent that the initial redesign was ordered on a 4-day deadline. The result flew on August 7, 1941. That speed of adaptation is the whole story. The P-3 and later P-3bis could fight, escort, and reconnoiter, but they never became a clean, heavy fighter solution in the way the original requirement demanded. They were improvised from a bomber and carried that compromise all the way through service. The P-3bis worked because the Soviet Union needed something now. It never became the aircraft the role actually deserved. The Polikarpov I-185 is one of the Soviet war's most painful what-ifs because it got far enough to make the argument real. In early 1942, the M71-powered aircraft showed performance better than the Messerschmitt Bf-109F in state testing, and by late 1942, it had gone through frontline combat trials with the 728th Fighter Aviation Regiment. Appeals were made for immediate production, and the aircraft was formally recommended for series manufacture. It still did not happen. The engine line was not ready in the way mass production required, aluminum and factory realities mattered, and other fighter programs were already moving. The I-185 was not killed by lack of promise. It was killed by timing, production risk, and a war that no longer had room to restart around a better idea. The Sukhoi Su-6 may be the clearest Soviet example of an aircraft that could win the comparison and still lose the war for production space. The M71F two-seat Su-6 passed state tests in 1943 with performance that stood about 100 kilometers per hour above the two-seat Ilyushin Il-2, and the aircraft's maneuverability and overall flying qualities were rated exceptionally highly. That sounds like the end of the argument. It was not. The M71 engine never became a secure production reality, and the Il-2 line was already enormous, entrenched, and essential to the Red Army's way of war. The Su-6 did not fail because it lacked quality. It failed because a better airplane still was not a better production decision once the Soviet system had already committed to another one. Soviet failures often died in mission mismatch, wartime production reality, and answers that arrived just as another answer had already taken the factory. The Italian fighter story is rougher, more uneven, and tied even more directly to engine power and industrial limits. So click into the next video and keep watching.